Hey, welcome back to Taste0ftruth Tuesdays. This week's episode, I'm sitting down with my friend Tina K, and we're not talking about one book or one article, but it's more of a meeting point between Tina's world and mine. Tina works with ruins, esotericism, and Norse-Germanic spirituality. And, my history is moving through the New Age spirituality, Christianity, and deconstructing both of those forms of spiritual practice. So our shared concern is fake spirituality, spiritual escapism, and authority without accountability. And we also are going to talk about the modern attempt to recycle Jesus through cosmic Christ consciousness, Theosophy, Steiner, New Thought, and other esoteric frameworks. So the big question that's underneath the whole episode is, what does real spirituality require? And how do we tell the difference between mystery, myth, and manipulation? So without any further ado, let's begin the interview. Hey, welcome back to Taste0ftruth Tuesdays. For today's episode, I am sitting down with a friend and someone you may or may not be familiar with, Miss Tina K from the Rune Shack Radio. So will you please just introduce yourself, a little bit of background on who you are, what you do, maybe define some terms for us, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the episode.
Well, my name is Tina. I'm really just a housewife, quite frankly. I'm a housewife with a certain peculiar interest that started early on in childhood, and it kind of followed along the same lines, not in the details, of course, but in the matter of our interest, it kind of followed along the same lines with other people who fell into this specific niche, let's call it, which is Norse-Germanic spirituality and esotericism, which can be abbreviated to runes, if we're really honest. And that is what I do on Substack. I write about that. I write about my personal experiences, but I also share the things that I've learned and that I've known and have known to work. I've been called certain names because I put everything behind a paywall. But that's just the way it goes, nothing for nothing and something for something else. I am very happy to share my knowledge with people that are interested in it, but not for nothing, because it is work at the end of the day. I put a lot of time and effort into everything. And that is just a law of energy, quite frankly. You have to give some to get some. And expecting a lot for very little generally doesn't tend to work out very well for people. That's what I do in short.
I think it's quite wise as a spiritual practitioner to put some of what you're doing behind a paywall. I think one of the first things we connected on was a post you had made about the misuse of ruins. And when people put out, you have to be very careful when you're getting advice from anyone on the internet. Right? Especially, I work in the fitness and nutrition industry, as you know. And so that's very, very important to keep in mind when you're watching someone's fitness journey, nutrition journey, making sure that you're not, just because it works for them, it could work for you, similar stuff, right? So I think a paywall helps protect yourself and others. And it does put a lot of energy and effort. I know I'm also putting content out on Substack, and I get so stressed out. I have 2 pains. So what drew you to runes or Norse-Germanic spirituality? Were you born and raised in this sort of mentality, or will you walk us through that? I'm sure it's a fascinating journey.
My grandmother was a Catholic, and she was a devout Catholic, but she had her interests. She had her little quirks here and there that fell very heavily in a folkish. Yeah, a bit of folkish witchcraft almost, but she would never ever have called herself that. In fact, she would have admonished you for calling her that. And she kind of was the inspiration for me to look into those things. And it started with tarot readings. She dragged me to tarot readings and to astrologers and to crystal ball readers. And I loved it. I loved every single minute of it. And it was not until much later, I think I must be around 14 or 15, I think 14, that I finally knew or saw runes. And it was the Germanic, the Elder Futhark that I saw, and I felt something, just this feeling of familiarity that was instant, and I had never heard of them or even seen them before that. And I instantly felt something in me connecting to it, like a recognition, a familiarity, is like this is something different. This is not like all the rest. Because of course all the rest was very interesting, but it didn't feel familiar in any way. And it wasn't, and I made my own set, and I dabbled with it a little bit, but then my real life at the time took over. I had too much to do. I was a couple of years later, I was already moving out, and it just completely fell to the wayside. And then when I finally picked it back up, it was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I did some readings for myself. And every single reading I did for myself was horribly negative and bad. And that was a very difficult thing for me, because I think, am I doing something wrong? Is there something wrong with me? How come nothing is ever positive? Well, yes, that's the brutal truth of it. It was me. I was doing something wrong. I was on a whole wrong life path, so to say. I was doing something that was not compatible with how I wanted to go through life, but my true will. And it doesn't really matter what that true will is, but it's much more aligned with what I'm doing now. And yes, that is unfortunately, well, it's not unfortunate. That is just the truth about runes, that they don't mollycoddle at all. If there is an issue, it can be pointed out very direct, and it did so for me. And then when I finally started to, well, work on myself, as they say, or made some very significant changes in my life and how I conducted myself, it gradually became better and better for me. And I actually managed that because I started to experiment with them in a magical way. So not just the divination, not just doing readings for myself or for other people. No, I really started to implement them in my life in a very intuitive way. And then I later, when I got to know people like Freya Aswin, and I read her book and I talked to her extensively. And when she was talking like, oh, this is how I got to know the runes, and I did this and that with them, and I was sitting there with my mouth open almost, thinking that that's how it happened for me. It is exactly how it happened for me. And there's many reasons why that may be, but it was so validating, most of all, because that it just meant that I wasn't just making it up, that I wasn't deluding myself into things. This is common, quite frankly. In fact, most people into esotericism go through that phase of self-delusion. And I think that is normal that you go through it, on the condition you can pull yourself out, because that is where most people will stumble and will not get out of.
Yeah, I think we're going to dive deeper into that as we get into the interview. As some of the listeners may know of my past in the New Age spirituality, and I get a little nervous with some types of esotericism. I have a hard time saying that word, as a lot of big words, or just that spiritual authority and how it can be abused or misused, or you can dilute yourself into escapist stuff. And so we're going to unpack that later. I really look forward to that. And I'll link the interview that we've done on your page for anyone who have missed that. So let's go back a little bit, because runes, I think, might be misunderstood. I don't know. My audience is very, very diverse. So I think they might know them as just like tattoos or symbols, or like, if there's something about in general when people think of runes that is misunderstood, what would that be, and how would you want to correct that?
Well, there's a few things, actually. We know for a fact that they were used as a magic system. That is in the sagas. That is visible on objects that we have dug out from the past. This is a known fact. And there is no really a one way to do that. There can indeed be room for experimentation, because how else did these things make it to the saga? Somebody experimented with things until they found a combination or a certain sequence that just worked. Another misconception is that they're only for divination. That is just not true. In fact, it It is a bit contested, but Tacitus wrote about this, that Germanics, when he wrote about the Suebi people, that they carved symbols on bones and stones and rocks and casted them on the ground to make predictions. We can safely assume that he was talking about the runes, about the Germanic Futhark, which is the oldest Futhark, and it was found originally in Germany, and then it spread later, and the Norse people and then the Anglo-Saxons, they all made their own versions or iterations of. And it's very possible that people connect with those much more easily, but it's not the case for me. That's also partially genetic, because I do believe that there is a genetic component to which magic will and will not work for you. There are forms of magic that are just incompatible with your genetics. That goes in both directions, by the way. That is not just true for white people, that is also true for Asians and Black people, etc. And because I am from Belgium, we are very, very German in our genetics, German and Dutch and French, a bit of a melting pot there. And that's why I think I got drawn to those specifically.
Yeah, I appreciate you clearing that up. You also have a Substack article where you went through how the runes were used in the sagas, and I will link that in the show notes because I found that to be very interesting. Appreciated you putting that together. And you also touched on some of those exact topics with a recent conversation with Torna that you just had about it's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been or your ancestry, and the gift it is to be more rooted into where you're from and getting to know that. And I think there's so much in modernity that we're truly disconnected from that, especially as Americans. Most people are waking up to the failed multicultural experiment and how important it is to be around like-minded folks when it comes to a high trust society. And so, yeah, I think we could move on. But I do understand kind of tapping into your genetics. And we've talked about that in my previous interview with you about learning that I'm Italian and trying to dive into who our ancestors worshipped past or into that pre-Christian time. And it's very difficult. And there's a lot to distinguish and to decipher. So talking about paganism, it's almost a negative slur, especially Christians. They love to throw that around. I don't really have a big issue with it. I understand some people don't like it. It's also hasn't ever meant spiritual practice by any mean. It meant, people that were, rural, right, outside of the city. How would you define like heathen or Norse-Germanic spirituality for someone who's unfamiliar with it?
Well, in all technicality, I am a pagan because I am a country bumpkin. I live in the countryside. I love it here. I don't want to live in a modern society. I'm so burned out on it all. But when it comes to spiritual practices, I would definitely consider myself a heathen because what I do is heathenry. There is a distinction there. Heathenry tends to be more of the Germanic parts of Europe that includes Belgium and Holland and the Netherlands in general. It is not because you wouldn't call somebody into the Greek or the Roman pantheon a heathen. You might call them a pagan in this day and age. There are other words when it comes to the Germanic spirituality, specifically also the Norse-Germanic heathenry, which is foreign cedar, and it basically means our way, and that is the only word or concept that we know that they used for themselves, and it just means our way. They might not have had a specific name for themselves for the way that they practiced, because everybody did it. There wasn't a need, there was no distinction as such, because we were all pagans. There was no need to explain that you were one.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm also someone who lives in the country, and yeah, I think back on the places and where I used to live when I was in Portland, Oregon, for example, and I have no idea how it was loud. There was overstimulation. There was no trees, lots of billboards, just the city live in, not to mention how dangerous it was. So when we talk about esotericism, did I say that right? Yippee. What does that mean to you? And I'd love for you to help tease out like the difference between a New Age fantasy and esotericism.
Well, it's in the word, really. New Age is mainstream. Esotericism is not. As opposed, we could say that New Age is exoteric, exo out, and esotericism isn't. That's true. I mean, there is a real attempt to make runes part of the New Age scene, which I've always heavily resented. I'm very outspoken about. That just goes. Look, I'm okay with the idea of cultural appropriation and that we shouldn't do it. I actually agree with that, but that goes both ways, and I will be very adamant about it when I see runes being dragged into the New Age scene. I do not agree with that. Now, can I stop people from doing it? No, of course not. But I'm going to have nothing to do with it. I will distance myself. You do what you do over there, and don't come over here in my space to do it. And yes, well, esotericism is basically spiritual religious practices that are only taught to small groups because they cannot be made mainstream, because there is an element of self-discovery there also. But and where are you going to learn that from? And there is always, and this is true across many beliefs and spiritual practices, the idea of a master. Now, this is a teacher, let's say it, but that's a wrong word. You need somebody to guide you, somebody that has already been going through these things and that can guide you through the muck, to where you are when you bump into that spiritual delusion stage. That happens to everybody that goes on these paths, and you need somebody to show you the right way. You still have to walk it, but because there is a real danger that if you don't have that you will stay there, to great danger to yourself spiritually. And that cannot be taught mainstream. That needs to be more on an individual and small group basis, because otherwise you're just a preacher.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. But where I get lost in is because of, I just hear cult and manipulation, and I just have trust issues, sis. And I was like, that's my issue, is like, how do I find a teacher? Because, I was faced with so much the hidden downloads, the claims of visions, initiations. I told you about the dreams that I've had. So I guess with New Age, I did not have a teacher, but there are plenty of teachers and gurus and guides and coaches in that world. And so I know that so again, how do we look for like red flags in a reader, or how do we know if does that make sense? Like how does someone like me, who's been used and abused through New Age and Christianity, to be okay to listen and trust and open up to someone? I before I pause, I'm thinking of the conversations like that Plato wrote, or with Socrates, posing lots of questions. I would think would be a good relationship with your master or teacher, someone that you can question, because that's the first sign of a cult. If you can't question the leader, you're in trouble. Was that a good starting point, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, because you want to know, you're learning, you're seeking. Questions are normal and to be expected. I mean, that's also why I say on my Substack, like, look, you can ask me any questions. I will answer all of your questions. Now, of course, that is reserved for the people that actually pay for that service. But no, you can ask me any questions, and I have answered all the questions. But I don't reach out to people. I have never reached out to people for a reading or to make them a subscriber of mine. I just don't do that, because I don't need to do that. If I had no subscribers, because how it started with me on Substack, I just started writing at some point because I needed an outlet. And then all of a sudden people started pledging that they wanted to pay for subscription. And I said, oh, that's wonderful, but I feel like I need to give something in return for it. And it started with monthly room readings. And then more people signed up, and the question came, Tina, would you please write a little bit more about runes for us? And I said, yeah, that's fair. Well, that's actually extremely fair, and I would love to do it. It was an immediate click for me. And that's how that started. It's that's just how that started for me. Like, I had people ask me. I did not go out and look for these people. And obviously, because I'm kind of a no bullshit person when it comes to these things, I don't use a lot of fluffy words or very lyrical descriptions of everything or very flowery language. I actually detest it because I think that just obfuscates a lot of things. And I think people appreciate that about me also, that I don't do that. Because there's no need for it. Things can be explained quite simply. If I am talking about runes, I don't need to go on a whole rant, tirade almost, about how it is described in 10 different ways. No, just get to the point. Just get to the point. That's what people want. That's what they're there for. They don't need all that. That's just filler. And another thing is, if people start to badmouth you, yeah, that's also sort of it was also sort of an indication for me, like, oh, if it seems to be stepping on people's toes that I'm doing this, and I'm also asking money for it. Yeah, well, I'll take that as a compliment. I really do. Other than that is just irrelevant, because these people will always come. Once you get to a certain point, it's almost inevitable.
Yeah. So your basic insights were that the people who are out there promoting themselves and trying to build a brand and a business are probably some red flags to look out for. And it's a similar conversation point that you and Torna touched on about how Torna came to grow or be in his role in the heathen and the Astro community, which I also have a hard time pronouncing that. It was given. It wasn't something that you seek to claim, correct? Is kind of one of the key distinguishings you were.
I have never once referred to myself as a vulva. Never.
Right.
Other people have. And even, there's even a book out there with my name in it, mentioning me, calling me that. Now, I never went to this person, that was Freya Azwin, by the way, and asked her to put me in that book. That never happened. So, it's of course extremely flattering also, because, it means, somebody recognizes you as a true seeker, you're not just out there building a brand. I don't have a brand. It's just my name on everything. You mentioned to me earlier before we started recording that you want to eat healthy and all those things, and that you do that. And I think that is one thing that is heavily underestimated in esotericism, especially in the more mainstream areas of it, is sobriety. Because your gut feeling does speak to you. You have a gut feeling, you have an intuition, that feeling of something's not quite right here, and I don't know what it is. And sometimes it can just be incompatibility. It doesn't even necessarily mean that this person has any bad intentions towards you, but you're just not compatible for whatever reason. And if we cannot listen to that feeling, if it's constantly being distorted by alcohol and drugs, or even eating bad. If you eat bad, then your stomach is always upset. It's going to influence everything. Your gut feeling is not going to be accurate, or at least it's much easier for it to get off point.
That is so true. And they say that the gut is your second mind. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The vagus nerve connects the mind and the brain. I talk a lot about this, especially later works from like 2024. But my last episode, I just talked about so much of this, about food reverence and how disconnected we are in modern society. And so, yeah, I'm so passionate about that. I try to keep in mind socioeconomics and how hard and expensive things are all over the world. So why do you think people are like we talked about it and on your Rune Shack Radio, the escapist mindset? What are people trying to escape? Even in that, even in that mindset that we were just talking about with these yogis, like it sounds like they're escaping, they're avoiding, they're parasites, they're living off others. So what does the heathenry path, what's different? And I know you can answer that for me.
Well, honor is a big thing in heathenry or in foreign theater. There is a high amount of accountability there. You know you're going to be held accountable for your actions, and that is normal, actually. In fact, something like this just happens in a group that I know exists. I'm not a part of, except from Facebook, that they expelled a member just for slandering another member, and they were very serious about that. They completely denounced him. And look, these things like that. Yes, accountability for one, but that harkens back to honor. And knowing how these people survived during the time that they did, when Europe was even pre-Middle Ages and we all lived in tribal context, a high degree of trust was necessary. You would have died otherwise. There is no way you could have survived a German or a Norse winter on your own. It is a death sentence. And of course, because you also rely on each other for food, you're going to trust each other not to cheat everybody, to not hoard things behind other people's back, to share. Okay, that sounds like communism maybe, but it was necessary at the time. And if you didn't, or you were found out to be doing these dishonorable things, there were real consequences for you. But it was necessary.
Yeah, I think that's really eloquently put. And I agree how necessary that sense of accountability or just experiencing consequences for your actions really is for a high trust and healthy society and a healthy civilization. So I do appreciate that. And I hope that the people in my community will hold me to such standards as I try to hold myself to.
That is something that I said to Torna yesterday, like all that you see here in this shack. This is my Wotan shack. I have Odin right there on the wall. I have him right here next to me. I have runes on the wall here. This is where I do my workings. Everything is here. This is not the core of my spirituality. None of it is. It's my family. Like, my family is the most profound spiritual experience of my life.
Yep. And that's beautifully said. And I appreciate that. So let's talk about Christ consciousness, please, 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 because I know it came through like Theosophy, New Thought, and I mentioned Steiner already. So sis, what do you make of this?
I will start by saying that I think Theosophy is largely bullshit. The woman that came up with it, Blavatsky, look, I can respect somebody for putting out the amount of work that she did, but there is no evidence at all, that she ever went to Tibet. So it's a bit like Guido van List, in my opinion, who made the Arman and runes. And that is where that whole thing about the misuse of runes came from, that prompted it. And excuse me. And just admit that it comes from you, because there is this whole legendarium around it that no, I went to Tibet and there I learned under the, what was it that she said, like the masters, or it never happened. And unfortunately, I think, to use a bit of a modern verbalism here, that is a bit of a psyops. I think this is prepping a population, because Blavatsky made this all mainstream, by the way. She didn't keep this in closed circles. She wanted this to spread far and wide. And that, I have to question your motives. I don't think she was out for money per se, but she was out for something. And we don't know what that something is. And the same for Guido van List. He also was after something. And we don't know what it is. Now, I've heard two things about von List specifically. Is that one, that it all came to him in a dream and through visions when he was very ill. And that I respect more than him saying, because I also heard this, that he claimed at some point that it was probably used as some long lost practice only available to certain elites. Well, then you broke. If that is the case, then you broke a whole tradition of secrecy. Why? That in itself already has like very bad haminya attached to it. You should never do these things. That's why voodoo priests say or talk about their rituals and things like that. They're things that they will never share with the outside world, only amongst themselves. That is totally legitimate and acceptable and understandable attitude to have, because that's the way it should be. Now, about the Christ consciousness and Theosophy, I have heard so many different things about it, but what it almost always comes down to is you just kind of need to vibe it, man. That's it. And what does that mean? That means nothing.
That's like that's my sticking point with esotericism a lot of time, because I guess like I know I've deceived myself. Like, I mean, I used to be a New Age person. I used to be a Christian. So why am I right now? You know what I mean? So I have a lot of issues with myself. But the fact that Jesus is constantly recycled, there's also growth now of like going to orthodoxy, to going back to high church as well, because evangelicalism is obviously a shit show. And a lot of folks I see on Substack who live, elsewhere, not in America, like to blame American evangelicalism, like to blame America for like the US-Israel relationship. But in my paper that's going to drop about Christ being a literary invention from scripture, it's so much bigger than America, like Latin America, India, like this Zionist Israel Judeo-Christian alliance is so much bigger than America. So I think folks want to just follow, the Russian propaganda calling the West satanic, just wanting to demonize the West, which sounds very Jewish, I think, to call us, Rome or satanic. And so I think a lot of that is fascinating. Even Steiner, have you read Rudolf Steiner's work?
Oh, yes, but it didn't stick, to be honest.
Yeah, I hear you. I feel the same way about it, but it's so popular on Substack, and so many of my listeners like him. So I try to be open-minded to understand, to try to connect patterns if there are some. I did mention Steiner's perspective about nutrition in my last article, so I did agree with some of that. But just this concept of trying to, redeem logos or the solar, the sun concepts in these mystery rites, I just don't understand why people want to fuse it with Christ. Like, why do you feel the need to bring Jesus, the second temple, apocalyptic, literary, Jewish fairy tale into it? And so from a heathen perspective, what do you think is lost when every tradition is trying to get universalized or filtered back through Christ?
Well, I am not and never have been a syncretist. I can have an academical interest in certain things, but I will never incorporate it into my own practices. That is just because, well, in the book that I just made a video about on YouTube, the Alderunar, said that perfectly, because that denies the uniqueness of our own gods and of our own spiritual body. And that's true. I agree with that completely, and I don't think it needs more words than that. That's a perfect, beautiful summary of it for me personally. And look, about the Christ consciousness, I also think this is just monotheism rebranded. Basically, everything back to the source, the one. It's like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't want to believe in that. And if you're going even more specific, the last thing I'm going to do, whether we're talking about Jesus the person or the Christ consciousness, it still harkens back to Jesus the Jew, and I am not worshiping a Jew. I'm not.
Right. I hear you. And that's the level of like moral disgust I have for that. And I do not comprehend why it's like the last firewall. Like right now, there's so much archaeological evidence and scholars presenting that the Hebrew Bible isn't as old as it's claimed, that it's just projecting into antiquity. And so many people accept this, that the Hebrew Bible has been stolen and fabricated. But no, Jesus, though, he was real. He was historic. And I'm like, what the flying fuck is like, if we follow the conclusion that then the New Testament is just the same myth-making second literary edition, Judaism for the Gentiles. Second sequel. It's pretty easy to see. I just don't understand why pagans will do this. I'm talking non-Christians are defending the historical Jesus. I cannot comprehend it.
I've had extensive talks about the nature of the Abrahamic God with a plethora of people, and they all seem to agree on one certain thing, that it behaves as a super demon, and that's true. Yeah. And I think that's what it is.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And so in closing down the interview, I feel like we touched on everything that I wanted to talk about. Is there any advice that you want to give to folks who are new to heathenry or paganism or just anything out there? Because there's so much misinformation, like we were already talking about, and just anything else you'd like to close down the interview with. I appreciate your time so much.
There is something that comes back in all pagan traditions all over the world, without exception. One thing, and that is that you, as a people, whether that is European people, Slavic people, African people, and Africans that even have their own tribes and further down, you are the spiritual children of your ancestral gods. That's where you should start if you're new to heathenry. Find out where you are from. Find your gods from the land that you are originally from. And that's your starting point. Because it's like software and hardware almost. If I go to Africa, let's say, and I start to involve myself in voodoo, that is a software that is incompatible with my hardware, and that is across the board. There are very few people that manage to have a healthy approach to syncretism. I see way more people go completely insane than they actually have a helpful that they're able to help themselves with it. Very few, and the few that I do know are disciplined people. These are people that have a disciplinary spiritualism in their life, and that is necessary. But yes, find your ancestral gods. That is your starting point. They are going to be the most compatible with you because they're your gods. They're in your DNA. They are in your blood. They will speak to you in a way that no other gods will.
That was really beautifully said. I really appreciate that and your time today and all your insights. I'll link your Substack, your YouTube, and that one Ruins in the Sagas article that I mentioned for the listeners. And I hope to have you back. I'm sure there's many other things we could talk about. And I know that we were going to do a talk with our friend Kim Morgan and talking about something. So hopefully the listeners will stay tuned because I'm looking forward to what the three of us are going to get up to. What about you?
I'm very excited about that. I have been for a while. It's just that all with our internet has been difficult to, and I have to catch up on a few things too. So I have very little time right now. But we will absolutely get to that at some point. Absolutely, because I want to do it. I've been wanting to do it. I've already thought of so many things. I've been bouncing ideas of Kim already. It sounds like a great idea. And I've been sort of pitching the idea to a few other people, and they were all excited about it. So I think It's a very good thing that we're going to do.
Oh, great. I can't wait. Well, then listeners, you'll have to stay tuned because we will have more information shortly. And that's all I have for you today, folks. So thank you so much for listening.